Sorry, folks, we seem to have a little technical blip going on here right now. I do not know what is going on, so I'm going to skip through the introduction part and just say to you that we are really excited to be here today for what is the last Genos Live of the season. So, as my background seems to have deserted me, and I look very funereal here, standing in my black against my black background, it brings to mind that French guy that used to do all of this sort of stuff. I'm going to dive straight in with our guests and with Aoife and hope that technically that part is working. Oh, God be praised.
Welcome, guys.
You're very welcome. And I see Richard, I think, just gave me a signal that I think he said that he can't hear us. Can you give me a thumbs up? Is that correct, Richard?
I mean, if he can't hear us.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
True.
Now, there's a great example of a stressed brain because we rehearsed this entire thing 3-4 minutes before we started, and everything was there. And then suddenly you go on live and there's a black background. But anyway, let me know. Richard is definitely not hearing us right now. I'm hoping that he's going to solve that. But in the meantime...
I did. I'm on.
He got
Yay!
you. Hey, great. Richard, good to see you. Sorry. You know what? Today is one of those days. This is the last episode of the current season of Genos Live. And I had some lovely pictures of you guys and some lovely introductory stuff. And I rehearsed it all at 1:15 and everything was working, you know, my weatherman background. And just as soon as we went live, boom. I'm standing in a graveyard in the middle of the night in a black shirt. So look, let's skip all of the to-do beforehand. I'm just thrilled that we have our two guests. So first, let me say, folks, to you that last time Richard was on, we had an amazing reaction to it. First off, we had a lot of people sign up for it, and we had a lot of people clamoring for him to come back. And he very generously agreed to, and he said, "I'll do one better. I'll bring back my research partner on the Neuroscience of Coaching, Anthony Jack, and we'll really dive deep into it." So, guys, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to join us today.
It's a pleasure.
I'm delighted.
So, before we dive into things, why don't I turn over to Aoife, as I routinely do, and I'm going to ask her to do the formal introduction of the two guys, and then we'll kick off. So, over to you, Aoife.
Hi, gents. Delighted to have you back, Richard, and pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Jack. First, I'd just love to give you a little taste of who you're talking to today, because we always like to get a feel for who do we have joining us, where in the world they are. So we have a flood of comments coming in on the chat on LinkedIn. We have people joining from Kenya, from Cape Town, from Puerto Rico, from Dublin, Ireland, from Bangalore, India, more from Cape Town, Canada, Argentina, France, Yorkshire, Greece, Belfast, Ethiopia, and Cork in Ireland as well. So all over the world. Folks, please continue. Post in your chat your questions and comments for our guests today. I'm going to be here behind the scenes monitoring those. But I think it's pretty clear that from the numbers of people that we've had that shown interest in the session today, that they're both very excited to have you both join us. But for those that haven't yet had the pleasure to experience your work or see you speak, I'd love to introduce Dr. Anthony Jack, who is a BA in Psychology and Philosophy from Oxford University and a PhD in Experimental Psychology from University College London. He then trained in Cognitive Neuroscience, which is what we're here a little bit to talk about today, at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, UCL London, and the Department of Neurology, Washington. Since 2007, he has been leading the Brain, Mind and Consciousness Lab at Case Western Reserve University. And in 2014, Dr. Jack also became the research director at Inamori, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, International Center for Ethics and Excellence. So we are delighted to have you with us today. And Mr. Boyatzis, welcome back, good sir, who many of you know is a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University, as well as a professor in the departments of organizational behavior, psychology, and cognitive science. Richard has won many awards at Case Western Reserve for research, teaching, and service. And he's also the author of many best-selling books, the latest of which is Helping People Change. If If you haven't had a chance to watch that episode, you can catch up with it on our YouTube, where we had Mr. Boyatzis joining to speak about that. And using his well-established intentional change theory and complexity theory, he outlines how to help people and organizations engage in sustainable and desired change. So, gents, you are both very welcome. We're really excited to have you with us today. We have a lot of eager coaches, consultants, trainers, folks that work in HR and L&D, ready to hear all about the neuroscience of coaching. So I'm going to hand it back to you guys. I will be here keeping an eye on the chat for you and letting you know any questions that come up.
Great. You just give me a wave when we have the first raft of questions and bring you back in. So thank you, Aoife, and thank you guys for being here. When we were setting up this session, and I hope Richard doesn't divorce me. Or end our friendship because I tell you this. But when we were setting it up, Richard said, you know what, Tony can do all the heavy lifting on this. I'm just going to be the eye candy for this session. So Richard is here as eye candy. And in the spirit of Tony doing all of the heavy lifting, let me tell you that Tony is currently writing a book. And the main theme of it is how good coaches and good training can help people rebalance a key aspect of the brain that our current culture and lifestyle is knocking out of kilter. So what we're going to do to kick off the session today is we're going to turn over for about 15 minutes or thereabouts to Tony. And Tony is going to talk about some of the key themes that were addressed in the research that himself and Richard undertook, and some of the themes that he's going to cover in the book. After which Richard and, or I should say Tony and the eye candy, will take questions and comments and so on. So as you work through this, and as you listen to Tony speaking, here's what I encourage you to do, because I know a lot of you, whether you're formally coaches or you are leaders who coach as part of what you do and lead through a coaching approach, you're practical people. Be thinking, what can I take away from this that is going to change in a positive way the way I'm doing things that will help people change more effectively? And if you find yourself with questions around that, pop them into the chat, and Aoife's going to give me a wave. She's off on an offside window there, and we'll bring it back in. So it's about getting you something from this session. So with that said, Tony, are you ready for myself and the eye candy to disappear into the background and let you do your thing?
Oh wow! I'll be by myself. Will I be in outer space or still here in?
It'll kind of be in this. Wait for it. This piece of technology is actually working, not like the first part. Well, I said that. I'm saying that, but I may press the button and it may damn well not work because with the way today is today. So I'm pressing the button that says Tony alone. Fingers crossed.
Okay.
Here we go.
Wow, that's rough. Okay.
Yay!
Very good. Well, great. Yeah, I'm gonna say a little bit to take you on a journey a little bit similar to my own. You heard that I started off in psychology, and then brain imaging was kind of taking off, and I happened to be right next to a major center for brain imaging in London, the Wellcome Center for Functional Imaging, and so that was what I did my first postdoc in after I finished my PhD, and then I went over to America, and I got a rather different approach to the brain. And then when I came to Case Western Reserve here, I was very fortunate that within around 6 months I met Richard, and that began a collaboration which has helped pull my head out of the clouds, as it were, out of the ivory tower and into a more practical view. So that is indeed the story I want to tell you. And you mentioned that I think that current culture is pushing us, it's unbalancing us. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that works in the brain. But I really want to start actually by just looking at a very old idea, so something that's really been throughout the history of the West, is a particular sort of idea about how the mind works. And this is actually a vase that is taken from, I think, around the 4th, 5th century BC. So this is before Socrates was even born, although in Plato we get a story about it. It's called the allegory of the chariot. And this allegory is about the relationship between reason and emotion. So in this story, we see the two horses, which represent different types of emotion, the base emotions and then the higher social emotions like pride and compassion. And but the key figure here is the charioteer. And the charioteer is, of course, guiding emotion. So I'll come back again. So that's a metaphor that's very sort of familiar to us, and particularly since the scientific revolution, and particularly in the last few decades, we've got a more and more of an idea that it is reason that we want to pay attention to, and not our emotions. So the emotions are thought of as irrational, and that maybe the biggest divide that exists in the brain is between reason and emotion, and we're supposed to choose reason rather than emotion. But one of the things that we actually found out from the last generation of neuroscience research, which was really looking at patients who had brain damage, and my PhD supervisor was one of those people who wrote a book, Tim Chalice, called From Neuropsychology to Mental Structure. So he wrote a very big, sort of big picture book about how looking at patients with brain damage could tell us about the structure of the mind. And the story I want to tell you is very much from the latest generation of neuroscience research, so from neuroimaging to mental structure. But from that previous generation of research, and some of you may be familiar with Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, and so he is a leader in this. What we discovered was that there really isn't a division in the brain between reason and emotion. So there's all sorts of practical decisions in how we navigate the world in an everyday way, where emotion is absolutely essential. It's part of our guide. It's tied into how we reason and think. So what is actually going on in the brain? Well, when I first got interested in neuroimaging, I was in London, and I was looking at the brain in this sort of standard way that cognitive neuroscientists do. They look at the brain through the lens of psychology. And they tend to focus in on particular brain areas. So often when you listen to neuroscientists, you'll hear them talk about very specific brain areas and circuits and about what they do. Now, what I came to realize over time was that while there is certainly plenty of value to that approach, and that approach is very good for extending existing theory and understanding what's going on in very specific contexts, like in specific sorts of tasks, like visual perception tasks, it's an approach that's actually rather too specific. It's got blinkers on, so you actually miss the big picture because you're already only seeing through things through the lens of the theory you already have. When I went to America, and I came to St. Louis, and I was at Washington University in St. Louis, I met people who took a rather different approach to the brain. And the approach they took was one that wasn't particularly informed by psychology. In fact, many of them didn't really know a lot of psychology, so that in a certain sense, they weren't that interested in the mind. But what they were really interested in is the brain and how it worked from sort of an engineering point of view. So I was actually sat next to, in a cubicle, a guy who's extremely noisy and lively, a guy called Michael Fox. He's now heads a research center at Harvard Medical School. And he was working on this. Now, this is showing that when you just look at the brain and you just look at how people's brain activates when they're given no task whatsoever to do, what you see is that there are two different big networks that tend to fight with each other. So they have this seesaw relationship, so that when one of these networks comes up, the other one goes down, and vice versa. Now, that's a very interesting finding, and in fact, it was something that people really couldn't make much sense of at first, and it caused an awful lot of controversy. But what it's telling us is something tremendously interesting about how the brain works, right? There is this huge divide in the brain. Not only are these two sets of brain areas that are separated physically, but they're actually, the brain is organized in such a way that when you activate one, you tend to suppress the other, and vice versa. So why is the brain organized in this way? And when I came to Case, I did some experiments to look into that, and along with lots of other researchers, what you can see is that one of these brain networks is really involved in what we think of as kind of canonical reason. So logic, science, math, what I call broadly analytic reason. And when you do an analytic reason task, when you think scientifically or you do calculations, what you do is you activate this analytic network and you suppress the other network. Now, what does this other network do? Well, it's really involved in social cognition, but not just social cognition. It's also involved in how we regulate our own bodies, how we regulate our emotions and our bodily states. So what's happening is that when you do an analytic task, you're turning off the brain areas that are important for understanding other people's point of view and for regulating your own body. Now, this observation was rather disturbing to me because here I was a university professor, and I was looking around, and we do try to help our students and educate them and have them to live a good life. I was looking around at what sorts of things we were teaching people in the academy, and indeed throughout the schooling they'd done before the academy. And I realized the vast majority of it is doing exactly that. It's turning up analytic reason and it's tuning it. Great. That's a great thing to do. But while it's doing that, it's turning off these other brain areas, which are so important for understanding other people and for regulating ourselves. And while it's not damaging them by turning them off, it's essentially allowing them to atrophy. Now, when I got to Case, most researchers had only been able to make the brain go this way, right? They'd only been able to either get it roughly even, or they got it to just turn on the one network and turn off the other one. But I found that when you gave people a really engaging social reasoning task, you really got them to get into the mind of someone else, then you could actually make it go the other way. Now I've forgotten which hand I raised, so I don't know if I'm going to get this right, but okay. So then you can actually get people to really engage this empathic reasoning task. So that's what I call it, empathic reasoning, because it's a type of reasoning that works with emotion. Whereas analytic reasoning is really the way analytic reasoning is really how Descartes said it is. And it's not surprising that Descartes thought that emotion and reason were distinct, because he, after all, contributed to mathematics and science, and that was some of his major contributions, and to the mechanistic philosophy, the beginning of natural science as we know it now, the sciences. So of course Descartes understood that sort of reasoning is divorced from emotion. It is absolutely true that sort of reasoning is divorced from emotion. In fact, not only do we suppress the brain areas that are important for regulating emotion and understanding emotion in others and ourselves, but we also often suppress the brain areas that are responsible for putting us in an emotional state when we activate analytic reason. But empathic reason, those other brain areas, sometimes it's referred to as the default mode network, although that's such a deeply misleading label that I don't like to use it, but you may know it as the default mode network. When you activate this empathic network, these are the brain areas that help us regulate our emotions. And in fact, there's no end of studies that show that it's the function of that network and its connectivity with more basic areas that are responsible for being in an emotional state, like the amygdala and the insula, that really predicts how psychologically well-balanced and healthy you are. So we basically live in a world that pushes us all the time into this analytic network and causes us to allow the other network to atrophy. And not only is that much of our education, but it's also much of our day-to-day life, because so much of our life is, of course, through electronics, which gives us a very, it does not give us a rich interpersonal experience of other people. It gives us one mediated by technology that kind of takes out the genuine empathy. So what do I think a coach should do? I think a coach should help us go into this other network, right, and help us to tune that, because that's the network that keeps us healthy and of course allows us to understand other people. And I think it's useful to think of these two ways of thinking as two poles of reason, right? So it turns out that the biggest division in the brain is not between reason and emotion. There is actually no clear division in the brain between reason and emotion. What there is a very clear division between two types of reasoning: analytic reasoning on the one hand and empathic reasoning on the other hand. And what we know from all sorts of data showing interference and various other things, and like what happens when you have a mental disorder, is that the brain is organized for a very good reason to keep these two types of thinking separate from each other, because if it doesn't, they tend to interfere with each other, and you tend to have low IQ or suffer from a mental disorder. So it's part of healthy function to keep these two types of thinking away from each other. But unfortunately, our culture only really trains one side of our very plastic brain, doesn't really train the other side. So it was wonderful to meet Richard when I came to CASE, because of course, a lot of work in emotional intelligence is exactly doing that. It's helping to train this empathic network, helping us to regulate ourselves and understand other people better. And I think that's really, it's a really important role that a coach can play in doing that, because after all, this is a network that is engaged by social contact. So it's one thing to kind of do some sort of abstract thinking about emotions, but you can do much richer thinking when you, of course, have social support, and you have you can do some experiential learning with other people, and then processing it with your coach and trying to understand what's going on with them. So I see the coach is really playing an essential role in today's society in terms of rebalancing us. Okay, that's me going for quite a while by myself, and I probably missed out all sorts of things and was unclear in various ways. So.
Not in the slightest. It was we had several comments coming in there, Tony, just saying absolutely fascinating, highly interesting. I haven't heard this before, etc. And I noticed, and nobody could see it when we were on there, but particularly at the end when you were talking about the role of the coach, Richard's head was nodding away there like crazy about the role of the coach and what the coach can do to sort of mediate this. So just wondering, Richard, can I throw it over to you and we start to do some of the transition from that really great introduction, which I think is bringing something new to everybody on this call, or many people on this call, to then what are the implications for coaches and managers who coach? Oh, we've lost you.
Oh, no.
We don't have sound. Are you muted by any chance?
Okay. You know what? Why don't I fill in a little bit, just picking up on what I was saying while Richard solves that problem.
Okay.
I want to come back.
Hey, we got you now.
No. Okay, sorry. It's the microphone and the speakers are a separate thing. Let me first correct a couple things. I don't really think of myself as eye candy. That was a joke. I think of myself as a cultural buffer between England and Ireland, and coming from one of the former colonies and working on a podcast for a company based in another former colony, Australia. I figure it's all a part of this détente. The second thing is,
thank you,
Tony, it's useful. I love the fact that you started with some Greek pottery, and you made a gesture to Socrates. It's very important to say that Socrates was mostly a good marketer. The things that are attributed to him were actually said by the 7 sages 200 of ancient Greece 200 years earlier. But thanks for the nod. I just want to make a couple links for the listeners. I'm not saying anything new. One is Tony's talking about these two opposing poles of reason and brain networks as really capturing a lot of what we think about as traditional cognitive intelligence versus emotional and social intelligence. And there's a reason why these two things are in such a battle. And still, among many scholars who give us horrible reviews on research and journals on emotional and social intelligence because they think the cognitive intelligence is the only thing. What we're saying is there is an underlying neural mechanism that differentiates them. Look, for decades, people thought management was task versus people, and it was always the two axes, from scientific management systems in the 60s into all sorts of the managerial grid and on and on and on. Well, it turns out, and Tony and I and one of our colleagues, Kylie Rochford, wrote a paper that came out in 2014 saying that a lot of this typology isn't just happenstance of tasks versus people. It actually is rooted in these major networks that have a lot of impact on our work life. The thing that's interesting is, A, they were rooted in something real, in something biological. The other is, in all of the management training, they always said the best thing to do is to do both. Well, as it turns out, you can't really do both. Now, you can toggle back and forth, and you can do it, as Tony and I keep talking about, in maybe thousandths of a second, who knows. But the fact is that when you aspire to do both at the same time, you just open the door for, as Tony just said, a certain amount of psychopathology. So the issue is ending up knowing how to go back and forth, and as you often say, Tony, is knowing which is the more appropriate. Just a humorous anecdote. Tony led us, several of us, on 7 different studies that was published in a piece on Why Do You Believe in God? And it was taking to task the atheism movement and the sense, certainly in the US, that people who have a particular faith are stupid, which is a part of the political divisiveness argument. Well, the field of cognitive psychology has basically, for decades, contended that people who have a strong faith are stupid, or stupider, I should say. They score lower on critical reasoning tests.
Right.
Well, Tony set out to show that that's not the case, that we have these two ways of looking at the world. So we did each of these studies. We submitted it to a journal that was publishing a lot of this stuff. And the article was 45 pages double-spaced. The critique with the rejection that we got back was 23 pages single-spaced, which meant the critique was longer than our actual article. And it was unbelievably vituperative.
It was also ultimately analytically incoherent, but there we are.
Oh yeah, that's right. It was ranting. It really was ranting. And part of it was, I thought it was a marvelous thing of saying that faith is much more linked to our emotional experience and our social experience. Well, there's one section in the discussion section where Tony was writing something and put in something about, if people are very much into this analytic mode and atheists, it does open the door to psychopathological ways of looking at the world or interacting. Well, the Daily Mail ran the headline on the PR on our article, "Atheists are psychopaths," which and then quoted our article. And so that led to a certain amount of PR, and actually we got invited by a podcast based in Tehran recently to explore that, because the feeling of the person who runs the podcast is, the faithless are really not doing God's work. So, given all of that, yes, fundamentally, coaches and leaders need to do both. And the question is, how do we develop them? And as Tony said, the dilemma is most of our education system, except Montessori, is all focused on developing one part. And then you get into school, graduate school, college, and the faculty, I mean, come on, how many faculty are known for their interpersonal skills and their ability to even make eye contact? I mean, they're not. They get hired and promoted for, as we say, knowing more and more about less and less every year, and publishing in more esoteric journals. So the challenge we have is that we think in higher education, we've discovered that the pedagogy, as Tony said, the way we teach, if we teach with more holistic approaches, we teach with emotions and values, we teach with teamwork where people are doing things with others, we are likely to help people build more facility going back and forth. And coaches need to do the same thing. And when leaders are trying to inspire people, sometimes they have to solve problems, and sometimes they want to inspire development. Look, the Great Resignation right now is not because people want to make more money. It's about people searching for novelty and just getting tired of how much their past jobs sucked. So what they're trying to do is find meaning, purpose, and interpersonal novelty. And if you take what Tony's describing, it's because an awful lot of managers keep approaching it thinking it's all about managing budgets and the human machine.
Yeah, actually, if I might, I want to just come back to what I started with, the allegory of the chariot. So one of the puzzles that you might think, and by the way, Richard, I do acknowledge that philosophy and Western thought didn't start with Socrates, but we have a much better record of through Plato than anyone else. But if reason is what we use to control the emotions, how is it that there are so many extremely smart people who are a complete mess, right? And who don't seem to be able to regulate their emotions at all? And Richard uses the example of university professors, and of course we're familiar with that. But you can look at quants as well in various different professions who are often not the most empathic or emotionally well controlled. So really, there's one sort of reason that is a very lousy charioteer, right? I mean, essentially, the only thing this type of reason can do, analytic reason can do, the rational type of reason, is either whip the horses or pull back like mad, right? It can't really do anything fine-tuned. You need empathic reason to be able to work with the emotions, to guide them, to be an actual competent charioteer. And in particular, we know that you need that type of reason to harness sustained motivation, intrinsic motivation, instead of extrinsic motivation from just what you're paid or whether you're about to be punished or fired, right? And that's a very important issue right now, because Richard brings up the Great Resignation. It's really a time when it's clearly very important for employers to realize that, yes, of course, salary is important. Of course, it's important that people can live a reasonable life doing the work that you employ them to do. But it is a sense of belonging and a sense of social connection and belief in what they're doing that is going to keep people in their jobs. And the more you micromanage them and overuse analytics, the more you're going to turn that off. You really have to.
Tony, let me ask you a question. I'm sorry. Let me ask you a question that fits into this issue of.
We really need your sort of resonant leadership. That's what we need to keep people in the. So I was just making a nod to your book, your best-selling book.
Right. Okay. Thank you. No, but related to this, one of the things you didn't mention was the issue of scanning the environment and openness to new ideas, and that usually is a difference between how as I've understood, your work and the others that I've read about. The analytic work, network helps us focus, which is why we can do more solving a problem or analysis. But doesn't as you call it, the empathic network, help us scan more on the periphery?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as you say, it gives us a more holistic view. It's tuned into interdependencies, whereas, of course, as it were, the definition of analysis is that you take things in small parts and you look at the local relationships between things. Whereas, of course, social cognition, or competent social cognition at least, and understanding systems in general, is often aided more by this kind of broader view that understands how context modulates things.
Well, the interesting link there is, if the empathic network helps us get a more holistic view of the other person, aren't we more likely to tune into their desires, their dreams, what motivates them? So when we're coaching or leading them, for us to tap into their inner energy to learn or change, we're not doing it. And I think a lot of the lack of engagement that we saw pre-COVID and now the Great Resignation comes out when people are doing surveys with people saying they're just not getting developed or the work isn't interesting. I mean, LinkedIn did some multi-thousand survey recently, and I saw it posted. I don't know the veracity of the rigor of it, but what they said the conclusion was that 94% of the people surveyed said they'd stay in their current job if they felt they were being developed. So I think there's a very interesting link here that people want development, purpose, and meaning, and yet their managers, if they're too focused on analytics or the financials or strategic objectives, aren't going to notice that. So then they're not going to experience it, and then they'll leave because they want to find some place where there's more development, novelty,
I think a good simple way of sort of thinking of the analytic and empathic networks and what sorts of thinking they tend us towards is that the analytic network, partly because it's all about logic, is the either or network. Hey, either P or not P is what we say in logic, but it's either true or it's not. We're just focused on the facts. Whereas, of course, the empathic network is all about understanding that there are many different valid perspectives, and that your background, your emotions, they color how you see the world. So you can have a different perspective on exactly the same set of facts. And the empathic network not only allows us to get some insight into someone else's perspective, but also to triangulate between that and our own perspective and reach a kind of, maybe compromise isn't the best way, but a sort of a third solution that works with both, which is a sort of both and solution. And I think, Richard, really, some of your really important work is about one of the most important mechanisms for doing that, which is coming up with a vision, both at an individual level and then trying to find points of contact between that vision and the vision of the organization. And it is that's the opposite of the polarized thinking that we tend to these days. And it's that sort of working with and finding these points of cooperation and shared vision that is going to generate that sense of belonging. But we're so bad at it now.
Gents, I'm just wondering.
And this is, wait, Derek, let me
go,
make
go ahead.
connection. This is one place where, Tony, you've done a lot of work at the Inamori Center on ethics and in the military ethics program you teach in and done research in, because part of the implication of this, seeing either or more holistic thinking, is moral reasoning and around fairness and judgment and the subtleties of different perspectives. And that brings me right to the heart of how do you help people genuinely engage with diversity and seek inclusiveness. And unfortunately, when they're into the either or thinking, it goes the other way.
Can I ask you, gents? Can I just ask you to connect there for a moment? So in the research paper, when you talk about in the neuroscience of coaching, you position two contrasting styles or two complementary styles, perhaps, of coaching for compliance and coaching for compassion. And am I right to connect that more logical part of the brain to that coaching for compliance, and the other part to the coaching for compassion? Because I think what the paper clearly showed was when you coach for compassion, when you speak to that social side, the non-analytical side of the brain, that's what's actually engaged people in. I'm just wondering, if that's the case, what's the message for the folks on this call that they really need to be focused on?
I think, Derek, my answer would be kind of, and I think Tony's too.
Okay.
That, yes, there is an issue that you can coach with the analytic network where you're trying to understand, build a model of the other person, what motivates them, and it's important. Yeah. And then if you, in your coaching moment with the empathic network, you're trying to understand the other person's feelings and follow them. And in the article, we contend good coaches are doing both, and they're going back and forth. When we talk about coaching with compassion versus coaching for compliance, we're actually talking about, are you coaching to the other person's desires, values, and relationships, or are you pushing them in a way you want to go? So it's not exactly the same thing. It really has more to do with intent. And the problem is a lot of people train themselves or are reacting to corporate messages of the sponsors of coaching to say, well, I've got to help these people fix this problem. I want to coach you to a very specific objective. And as soon as you get very specific in the objectives or very specific in the problem solving, you're pushing them in a certain way. You're becoming a helping bully. And that's what we call coaching for compliance. The dilemma is, and this is where it kind of overlaps, very often that comes out of the person in the helping role getting too caught up in the analytic network.
Gotcha.
Is that fair, Tony?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think, although I do think that it isn't just the coach, I think we bully ourselves too. So I think what Richard has really done is he's identified that there are, in the context of when you think about how do you want to improve yourself, there are these two kind of particular states you tend to get into. And he actually has labels for them. One tends to be more positive and the other more negative. So the positive and the negative emotional attractor. And we tend to get caught up either in like our hopes and our dreams and generating a genuine vision that we can motivate ourselves with, or we tend to get caught up in the shoulds. And often, of course, we're quite capable of shoulding ourselves, and we all, or most of us, have a voice from our parents when we were young going, you should do this, you should do that. So we can internalize it, no problem, right? But that's no less damaging, really, when it's internalized, because it still kills our motivation. And it's really only by coming through to this other state, calming down on the shoulds and allowing us to tip into this other state where we're really motivated by things that genuinely are attractive to us in the future, that we can sustain our motivation.
Folks, can I bring in, I see from AFA that there's a big list of questions coming in from the folks, and I'm afraid we're going to run out of road for them. So if it's okay, I am going to bring AFA in and just ask her, what are people, first off, I just had a quick look down and I see the thing, the messaging is going crazy. What are people asking, AFA?
Now, I'm doing pulling a mute on it. We do have lots of different comments and questions, and they may relate to different elements in the conversation. So just keeping that in mind. Bikram just shared a comment there. He said to Tony, this is an aha moment for me. I've worked all my life with engineers, and I know, and they know they're bad at EI, but never understood why. Interpreting what Tony said, they're good at analytic reasoning, so the empathetic reasoning gets diminished. So Robin has a question here. What does this potentially mean for workplaces encouraging remote or at best hybrid working, therefore potentially minimizing social or team contact and interaction?
Good one.
I mean, it's a great point. So I think, I don't know if this was exactly the aha, but I think one of the most important ahas for me was just the realization that you don't get to be analytic at the same time that you're empathic. You don't get that because our brain evolved to not allow it. So, you can hope for it all you like, too bad, right? But you have to put aside analytic thinking, at least for a moment, to properly go into competent empathic thinking. And I think, it's that idea that you really have to push it aside. And then, of course, you can return to it. So I think, after you've allowed yourself to think through something empathically. So I think that is a really important realization that psychology has not caught up with yet. Psychology hasn't caught up with the lessons of the brain's evolved structure. Now, the other question, I'll say something. Oh, sorry. And then Richard, I'm sure, will have more to say. So I do, obviously, there's so many incidental bits of social contact that are so important to our days. And indeed, there's work. Not only are we in a loneliness epidemic, right, and has empathy been like precipitously falling over the last few decades, right? But then on top of that came the pandemic that made us separate from each other. And so we're really sort of in a toxic environment in terms of not being an environment that encourages us to have as much social contact as is healthy for us. And I think there are many upsides actually to working from home, but so I don't think it's a simple story. but it's really requires us to be aware of the fact that there are all these sorts of social contact that seem incidental, that you might not think about, but end up actually being tremendously important for your mood and for the function of your organization. Richard?
Because working in a virtual environment denies us the casual, as Tony said, the moments where you chat with each other in the hallway or on the way to a meeting or something. What we're missing is a lot of the social context. And when you have work-based meetings, people who are really good at it have begun to make sure there's a time at the beginning for check-in. But it's not like just 5 minutes. I mean, Tony and I and one of our co-authors had a meeting for an hour and a half the other day on a paper we're working on, and we spent a good 20 minutes on the check-in. And it made the rest of the time go really much more effectively. So part of the issue is we need the social context, and when you're on virtual meetings, be careful about being too task-oriented. The other aspect of it, as Tony brought up, is the issue of loneliness. The pandemic has led to a high degree of social isolation. If people had any underlying neuroses or tendencies for that, it's exaggerated it. When you add the fear from the acute stress and the threat of either the financial or the physical parts of the pandemic, people are not in a good place. Then we see this meta-analysis of studies of victims or people who have had COVID, even mild COVID, Omicron, asymptomatic COVID. One of the things is there is a measurable amount of loss of white matter in certain parts of the brain. Now, the good news is it can be reversed. But the bad news is it looks like it's in the parts of the brain that are very much attached to social interaction, like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. That means that the actual disease itself is accentuating the very thing that the pandemic is causing in terms of more isolation. So unless we intentionally start to do things that are replenishing, whether those are the classic issues of meditation, yoga, prayer, physical fitness, but the interpersonal ones are really important, to be spending literally more time with one's loved ones and family and pets, with one's colleagues, and not to be in a rush. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, people may not know, but like the research over the last 20 years has really shown that the single most important factor for your health is the richness of your social connection. Yeah. So that seems very surprising to people. If you really understand the brain, it doesn't seem surprising at all, because the social areas are the ones that are connected to how you regulate your body. So essentially, if you're disregarding that network, you're not just disregarding your ability to understand other people, you are disregarding your ability to regulate yourself. But there's now excellent work that goes all the way down to the cellular level and the expression of pathways for stress that shows that the lonelier you are, the more susceptible you are to stress and the more inflammatory responses you have. And those are just the responses that are killing us anyway, for diabetes and heart disease, etc., and hypertension, but also that is one of the mechanisms of COVID. So it's terribly ironic that the isolation only exacerbates the main problem.
Can we take one or two more questions? This could be a topic that could run on its own. I would say for an hour just talking about that, and that's a fascinating idea that the disease, Richard, which had gotten past me, is actually attacking that part of the brain that is actually being compromised, if you like, by the pandemic in general. Eva, is there a couple more? At least there were more than a couple more questions. We're not going to get to them all, but what have we got?
Thank you. So Teddy's asking, should we work to strike a balance between the two types of reasoning? So what would you propose as a good strategy to coach employees to strike a balance between the two?
Yes. What it means is when you're managing or leading or coaching someone, make sure part of the conversation is about them. make sure part of the conversation isn't just about the objectives or the tasks or how well the organization is doing, but it's about what's going on in their life. One of the questions that Tony and I have done a series of fMRI studies on, is that when you coach people to their vision, their dream, not goals, but their dream of an ideal life, it lights up many parts of the brain. In particular, a number of parts in the empathic network that are key to a person considering what's going on in life in the world. And I think even in staff meetings, it's the same thing. I mean, we recommend that people start staff meetings not with a report on the financial progress, which goes the opposite way, closes people down. It's too much premature focus, I should say. But in fact, open up with a little bit of discussion about purpose. Why do we do this? Get some people to share stories of customers that were engaged, or patients or students. That tending to those sides of our experience isn't wasting time. In fact, it's helping us be more open. So whether you're doing it one-on-one or you're doing it in staff meetings, I think that's an important part of the process and the mix.
Yeah. This kind of actually feeds in. Sorry, no, go ahead.
We have this lag because we're going across different oceans, but yeah, so it's making a little bit.
Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, I call it the mind's essential tension, because of course there's no sense in which Richard and I are against analytic. In fact, we may both tend a bit more to the analytic than the empathic. So, you know, they say of psychologists they study their own deficit. So of course you need both sides. You need to keep a balance. I would just add to what Richard said, which I think is absolutely right, that and this was particularly salient for one person I coached, a CFO, is that managers should remember that they shouldn't obviously just allow their emotions to leak out everywhere, but that they let people know some of what they're experiencing is actually makes them human, makes contact with other people, and importantly, makes them understand that their decisions aren't, you know, just something that just gets handed down without thought, or that they're often trying to weigh different things. And so that can make it more acceptable to people that decisions are being made that aren't ideal for them. So I do think it's very important that managers also are emotionally expressive to a degree about what's going on with them as a way of making contact too.
I see a couple of people paraphrasing there. Oh, sorry. There's that lag again. Off you go, Richard.
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the things that makes it difficult is there are cultural differences in terms of how easy or appropriate that is. And then there are gender differences that overlap with the cultural differences, that certain people of certain genders can express certain emotions and not others because it gets misinterpreted. So when we're talking about these neural aspects of it, it's the human. It doesn't matter what race, what gender, what country, what ethnicity, what faith. This is what's going on in the human brain. The dilemma is we have a cultural context, and that sometimes makes it difficult. I mean, one of the observations that I like to make is that a lot of the human development movement, the small groups and the small group movement, didn't start at Harvard. It started at MIT. The OD movement started in Southern California in the aerospace industry. The career development movement started at NASA. That a lot of the human development and recognizing human potential start in very technical environments. And I think it's because they are missing it, but they're very smart people. And when you open their awareness to it, they go, oh my God, you're right. The problem is, I think often if you're not guiding people around it, they try to put it in a task box. And that's one of the dilemmas we have. But if you look at the organization cultures that a lot of people revel at in terms of their innovation and productivity, whether it's Apple or Google, they do a lot of things that look counterintuitive to typical chemical manufacturing companies with people's time and the recreation and all the rest of it. But they're getting a huge amount of people's talent showing up at work every day.
Folks, we are going to run out of road. It's amazing how quickly 60 minutes goes by. A couple of people were just throwing in kind of, press aid summaries of some of the things you were saying. Elaine was saying, "Hey, turn up the warmth in these formal settings." Somebody else, Matthew, said in meetings, share vulnerability and personals to meld before we start on the dry stuff. But gentlemen, as ever, and I don't want to abuse your time, we're about 2.5 minutes away from the end. Want to thank you very, very much. Really, really appreciate it. Next time we'll do it for a 3-hour session.
Just think of it as different episodes of season 1.
Yeah, well, there you go.
We're now ready for the 3rd episode.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think actually, Richard, it's a very interestingly valid analogy, because this did build somewhat on what we were talking about in the last session. So it's a really interesting progression. Tony, really delighted to meet you. Richard, lovely to see you back. If you can hang around for 60 seconds in the background after I just say goodbye to folks. In fact, I'm going to say goodbye from here because my weatherman thing with the slides behind me is not working, so I can't do my usual close down. So technology has screwed me over. So I hope you'll hang around so we can say a formal thank you to you. Let me say a formal thank you to everybody who's on the call and has been with us through the first season of Genos Live. We have a great season lined up for you starting in September, first week of September, and we'll publish that over the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much. Stay in touch, and we'll talk to you again. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. See you next time.